You may ask, why are we beginning a NAFTA conference talking about labor? Of course, labor was not part of the NAFTA agreement. It was left out on purpose. And that made NAFTA into a free trade area rather than an economic community, more along the lines of the European Union. So why begin with labor? Well, of course, NAFTA has been intimately related to the question of labor migration from the very beginning. I've got a few telling quotes from two of the architects of NAFTA that I'd like to begin with. President Salinas argued that NAFTA would help Mexicans to, Mexico to export goods and not people. In 1993, shortly before NAFTA went into effect, he said that today, Mexicans have to migrate to where the jobs are being created. With NAFTA, employment opportunities will move to where the people live, reducing migration drastically. And President Clinton echoed these sentiments in his particular manner of speaking when he said, if NAFTA passes, you won't have what you have now, with everyone running across the border to get a better job. Instead, there will be more uniform growth across Mexico, and people will be able to work at home with their families. Now, for all of NAFTA's benefits, and we heard about a number of them yesterday, and principally, in my estimation, they surround the question of trade. Despite all those benefits, these optimistic predictions of two of the architects of NAFTA were clearly too optimistic. And today, the panelists are going to talk about the flow and recently the ebb of labor migration, and a series of issues related to employment in Mexico and perhaps in the United States. I'm not entirely certain. It's a bit of a mystery. We'll discover it together. The panel is called Migration, Jobs, Healthcare, Working Conditions, and Workers' Rights, and it features an all-star cast of presenters. We're going to begin today with Mónica Verea, professor at UNAM and founder of the Center for North American Studies. We'll follow her presentation with one by Professor Douglas Massey of Princeton University, who's done pioneering work on migrant laborers from Mexico. Following him will be Professor Bryan Roberts of UT Austin, who is an immigrant worker himself and a recent past director of the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies. And we'll conclude with a presentation by Ernesto Cortes, co-director of the Industrial Areas Foundation that I have just learned provides leadership training and civics education to over 10,000 low-wage earners, many of whom are in the Texas and border region. And Jacob Cortes will also be part of the presentation. He is an SEIU organizer, or has been an SEIU organizer in Pima County. So we'll have 15-minute presentations. I have these fancy cards that I made up this morning to tell you when your time is elapsing, and that will give us sufficient time for comments and questions from the audience. So let's begin with Professor Verea.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter, for having invited me to this important event. I was here 20 years ago with my old friend, Sidney Weintraub, to write an introduction about the NAFTA and labor that we gathered together with Rafael Fernandez de Castro. So it's my pleasure to be here again. As it is well known for all of you, NAFTA has no provisions to allow immigration among the three countries. U.S. negotiators believe that the dynamic exchange of goods would foster greater economic development in Mexico, creating a significant number of jobs, and as a result, reducing the pressures to emigrate north. This not only did not happen, but the flow increased due to the fact that the push-pull factors of migration have not decreased during this period. Which have been the main reason for this, among others? The significant salary gap between Mexico and the US and Canada, the strong interconnections which have constantly evolved during these last 20 years and have woven a sophisticated bilateral labor market that still functions well, despite that it has become much more expensive to cross the border illegally due to the significant increase in the area's reborderization process. The ongoing tradition of hiring Mexicans by US employers, whether with a temporary visa or under the table, has been a constant mechanism that constitutes invaluable human capital that is exported but not recognized. In this complex regional process, agents intervene to get visas for possible jobs, while traffickers charge large sums of money for transporting irregular immigrants. As an incentive to trade and investment, NAFTA established 4 non-immigrant trade NAFTA or TN visas that would be granted under 60 classifications for temporary moves of professionals and their families. None of the Cedillo, Fox, and Calderon, and so far Peña Nieto administrations tried to explore the possibility to initiate a collateral treaty within NAFTA as an option for medium or low-skilled labor mobility, knowing that this arrangement would imply negotiations in energy that Mexico considered non-negotiable. President Fox did, for the first time, propose a bilateral agreement in 2001, the famous Enchilada Completa, just before the terrorist attacks, which obviously did not prosper. It is fair to recognize that during the last 20 years, Mexico's trade and foreign direct investment grew significantly. Exports from Mexico grew from $144 million to $1,000 million a day, and direct investment to Mexico grew 10 times. Even though Mexico did not grow as was expected to, for many reasons, without NAFTA, the situation would have been much more difficult. So the belief that a lot of jobs would be created in Mexico within NAFTA and would eventually diminish the push factors of the traditional Mexico-US migration pattern did not respond to NAFTA. So I pretend to give you a broad picture about the migration trends of Mexicans to the United States during the last 20 years. What about immigrants? Almost 3 million Mexicans entered as immigrants with a green card, more or less an average of 55,000 a year during the period. In 2012, 1 million immigrants were admitted in the United States, 14% from Mexico, nearly 2/3 by family reunification process. Of the 1 million admitted in 2012, 16% were admitted by employment category. India got the first place, receiving 22% of them. Mexico got the 6th place, receiving 5.5% of them, almost double from 1994. Naturalizations. An increasing number of Mexicans have become US citizens. 1.2 million got the naturalization during these 20 years. Only in 2012, 1,000 got it. The non-loss of nationality law approved in Mexico in 1997 during the Cedillo administration was created as an incentive for the legal US residents to have more interest in belonging to their new country and obtaining the rights that they deserve as US citizens. Today, 9 million US citizens of Mexican origin have 2 passports. Nevertheless, still nearly 2/3 of Mexicans that are in the US legally have not yet taken this step, maybe because it is costly or they do not intend to stay all their lives here. As you well know, Hispanic population of the United States has grown significantly. In 2012, there were 53 million Hispanics, 37.7 million of Mexican origin. Therefore, the Hispanic and Mexican populations have doubled between the last 20 years. No doubt, Mexico is the United States' most important source of both documented and undocumented immigrants. What about non-immigrants? During the 90s, an important number of foreign temporary workers were hired in the US labor market because of the sustained economic growth. It is important to stress that the number of visas granted annually is a reference for legal migration that is reflected by statistics given by the Department of State, whereas the Department of Homeland Security reveals the multiple entries a visa holder does in 1 year. If we compare visas issued against the total number of legal entries per fiscal year, we can find an important increase of entries per visa issued between these 20 years, growing from 1.6 entries to 6.8 entries per granted visa. This means that non-immigrants have got more means to get more mobility than they did before. Nowadays, the largest share of work visa for all nationalities goes to highly skilled workers, contrary to the widespread belief that the most visa go to unskilled employment visas. This has been the case during the NAFTA era. That is the case also for Canada. In 2012, 74% of the total amount of visas were for H-1B visas, L-type for intra-company transfers, and NAFTA visas. What about high-skill visas? During these 20 years, it grew from 2,000 visas were given to Mexicans, occupying the 6th place of the total. They grew constantly, occupying the 3rd place after India and Canada. Nevertheless, they only represent, for 2012, 4% of the total. In terms of intra-company visas, Canada moved from the 6th to the 1st place from 25% of them. Instead, Mexico got 3 times more L visas, from 3.5% of the total to 11% of visas during these 20 years. The number of TN visas created by NAFTA given to Mexicans in the United States has been low, even though they have grew from 160 visas at the beginning to 7,600 in 2012. Still is a figure very low compared with the tremendous dimension of trade among both countries. Low-skill visas for Mexicans corresponding to agricultural and non-agricultural workers increased almost twofold, from 40% of the total in 1990 to almost 26% of the total in 2010. So Mexico is one of the countries that benefits more from this type of work visas. For agricultural workers, while at the beginning 21,000 workers were admitted, for 2012 it grew 3 times. They got 61,000 visas. 94% of them were Mexicans. If we compare this data with the temporal agricultural workers program in Canada, where 17,000 Mexicans were hired in 2012, it represents almost 25% of the ones that were hired in the United States the same year legally, not counting the huge amount of undocumented workers that work in this sector. For non-agricultural workers in 1997, only 7,000 Mexicans were granted this visa. It grew outstandingly rapidly to 52,000 in 2004, decreased during the financial crisis, and grew again to almost 40,000 visas. While visas issued for Mexico represented 49% of the total in 1997, in 2012 their participation grew to 73%. Under the Canada-Mexico partnership during the Calderon administration, both countries designed a new labor mobility mechanism that enables Canadian employers to hire Mexicans, non-agricultural workers in any sector and in any province for up to 4 years. Unfortunately, only 160 Mexicans got that visa during the last year. This represents the typical trend to get bilateral agreements instead of trying to trilateralize agreements. The lack of leadership within the 3 countries to go beyond NAFTA has been evident. Now I'm going to talk about undocumented immigrants, the reinforcement policy. Even though it has become much more expensive to cross the border illegally due to the significant increase in the area's reborderization process, the number of undocumented aliens living in the United States has grown significantly, from 3.8 million in 1994 to 11.7 million in 2003, 52% of them of Mexican origin. In 1992, only 5,000 Border Patrol officers were watching the border. In 2012, 21,000 border agents with support of an important number of National Guards were hired. Reinforcement at the border has been brutal, increasing significantly the cost to migrate and the growing dangers of border crossing, resulting in an increase in deaths and human rights violations. Experience demonstrates the tougher the measures, the more likely immigrants tend to remain in the United States. In 2012, the number of apprehensions were 365,000 Mexicans, 78% decrease from the 2000, a booming year which peaked at 1.7 million apprehensions, whereas apprehensions of non-Mexicans has been growing lately. Several studies have shown a reduction in immigration flows from Mexico to the United States. The net migration flow, Mexicans who come to the United States minus those returning to Mexico, has reached an equilibrium point, as we never thought it could happen. deportations. By expanding the participation of state and local law enforcement agencies in immigration enforcement through secure communities and the 287 GA agreements, all of them have allowed local authorities to get involved with unauthorized immigrants living in different communities and states, sometimes held by vigilante groups, and have led to an impressive increase of apprehensions and deportations of unprecedented numbers. This situation has originated a very harsh anti-immigrant environment in some states, being Arizona and Alabama the emblematic ones. Those states are emblematic precisely because there are new destinations than the traditional ones, or their Latino population grew rapidly and they react adversely against their evident presence. The results of these anti-foreign attitudes towards illegal aliens having to emigrate either to other states, voluntarily return to their place of origin, or rather stay much more vulnerable. I have been so preoccupied by this issue that I am going to leave Peter this book on anti-immigrant sentiments, actions and policies in North America and the European Union. The Obama administration apparently has deported mainly apparently criminal illegals, but there have been many raids to localize undocumented aliens in their workplace. Between 2009 and 2012, his administration deported 1.6 million immigrants, more or less the same amount Bush deported during this 8 years presidency. The phenomena of return migration is a new one in Mexico, and by the way, a very problematic one. For example, between 2010 and 2012, the US government removed approximately 2,000 mothers and fathers of US citizen children. The number of Mexican children impacted by deportation during the last years is around 650,000. It is a fact that transnational families in situations of separation between the US and Mexico needs to be attended. A reunification process is urgently needed. Local communities in Mexico do not have sufficient programs to help returning migrants and their families, which are returning mainly to rural areas who have limited infrastructure to respond to the complex needs of transnational families. Probably some of those deported aliens may attempt to return when the US economy improves more because some have left very close family members in different states. Aware that large amount of undocumented aliens represent a big problem, Congress has debated and approved several bills in 2006, 2007, which became frozen during 6 years, and again in 2013. Latino support to Democrats in the last elections were determinant. The Senate has proposed a bipartisan comprehensive bill that includes, among many initiatives, a legalization program with a 13-year path to obtain citizenship. The House of Representatives has proposed several pieces with no intention so far to legalize them with a path to citizenship. It is urgent that Congress approves a truly comprehensive immigration reform to provide opportunities for those increasingly vulnerable, unauthorized immigrants. A deportation relief is urgent for this community, but also it's urgent to look ahead with a strategic vision to the future needs for the labor markets, establishing programs to import labor or increment visas for that purpose. The important growth of exports and foreign investment in Mexico has been insufficient to create all jobs needed, push wages up, and reduce the pressure to emigrate to the United States as NAFTA negotiators had hoped. No doubt, NAFTA did create a space for greater formal and informal, documented and undocumented labor mobility. Legal flows grew very importantly, as well as unauthorized ones. It is relevant to ask ourselves what should be our next step within NAFTA. Is it feasible to renegotiate this treaty to include some immigration mechanism? Now that Mexico has approved an energy reform, could it be a good opportunity for a more ambitious regional project, including labor? Given the infrastructure created by NAFTA, is it essential to analyze the possibility of increasing the number of TN visas and expand the categories of professionals into middle-skilled technicians, and also establish a category for low-skilled workers so current undocumented workers could be allowed to adjust the TN status? Maybe NAFTA is an ideal platform upon which immigration reform can be based, at least as it pertains to Mexico and Canada. Mexico does not have any migratory privileges, not even a waiver one. NAFTA could open the door and move towards legalization for those who have been living many years contributing to overall U.S. economy and who have children with U.S. citizenship or dreamers who could get temporary visas while obtaining a permanent one. And I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move now to Professor Douglas Massey.
The consequences of NAFTA are defined as much by what it didn't do as what it did. What it did was lay out a framework for the integration of the North American economy, lowering barriers to cross-border movements of goods, capital, information, services, commodities. Of course, what it didn't do was make any arrangements for the movement of people, for the movement of labor. And indeed, the United States insisted on its right to control and limit migration from Mexico to the United States. And over the past 20 years has in fact engaged in a profound policy of border militarization, dramatically increasing first border enforcement and more recently internal enforcement directed against undocumented migrants, the vast majority of whom are Mexican. In 1993, the Border Patrol launched Operation Blockade in El Paso, and to celebrate the initiation of NAFTA in 1994, the Border Patrol launched Operation Blockade in San Diego. And over the next 2 decades, the number of named Border Patrol operations has proliferated. Between 1986, when the militarization really began under the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and the present, the Border Patrol number of officers has increased by a factor of 6. Its budget has increased by a factor of 25. The Border Patrol is now the largest arms-bearing branch of the U.S. government, save the military itself. So the United States pursued a fundamentally contradictory policy, pushing to integrate all factor markets in North America with the exception of labor markets, to create somehow, magically to create an integrated market where one market is not integrated. And to finesse this contradiction, it militarized the border with its second largest trading partner. The consequences of this fundamentally contradictory policy have been dramatic and dire and counterproductive for both countries. The militarization of the border paradoxically had little effect on the number of entries into the United States without authorization, had little effect on the rate of undocumented in-migration. The paradoxical effect is that if you raise the costs and risks of border crossing, migrants, being quite rational people, minimize border crossing. And the undocumented did this by hunkering down and staying once they'd experienced the costs and risks of border crossing. And the rate of out-migration, the rate of return migration, plummeted, causing a huge boom in the undocumented population and a huge increase in the size and proportion of the Hispanic population in the United States. All this occurred not because the rate of in-migration had changed in any way, but solely because the rate of out-migration, return migration, plummeted in response to U.S. border policy. It was completely a self-inflicted wound on the part of the United States. During the 1990s, we were spending $3 to $4 billion per year in border enforcement so as to double the net rate of undocumented population growth. Demography has a simple equation. Net migration equals in-migration minus out-migration. If you implement a policy that has no effect on in-migration and dramatically reduces out-migration, net migration arithmetically must increase. And that's exactly what happened. So over the past 2 decades, we shifted from, in the early 1990s, and after the legalization program of IRCA, from a population of around 1.5 million undocumenteds to a peak in 2008 of 12 million undocumented migrants, 60% of whom were Mexican. The remaining proportion were largely Latin American, about 20% were Central American. So it's very much it's not a global problem, it's a regional problem. 80% come from Central America or Mexico. So we currently have an undocumented population of around 11 million. And NAFTA, and combined with the militarization of the border, have had this paradoxical effect of producing a stationary, a static, rooted, undocumented population trapped north of the border and increasingly connected north of the border, giving birth to a new generation of US citizens of undocumented parents. But at the same time, NAFTA has given rise to a new circular flow of legal immigrants. The integration of the North American market has brought about new increases and new qualifications for a variety of legal visas. In 1996, when the US Congress passed the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and began to strip away civil rights from not only undocumented migrants, but from all non-citizens in the United States, it helped to spur a massive surge among Mexicans towards naturalization, defensive naturalization, to protect their rights in the United States, aided by Mexico's recognition that this was a necessary step and its provision for dual nationality. So Congress, in a series of 3 pieces of legislation in 1996, stripped away civil, social, economic rights away from non-citizens in this country, making the status of a non-citizen increasingly vulnerable. And in response, Mexicans naturalized in the millions. So by turning up the heat, increasing the pressure on non-citizens, Congress prompted millions of Mexicans who otherwise probably would not have naturalized to take on US citizenship. Now, the thing about US citizenship is that it creates rights for entry under the US immigration system. A permanent resident alien, a green card holder, has the right to petition for the entry of spouses and minor children, subject to numerical limitation. And the lines waiting for these preference visas are long. If that same person suddenly naturalizes, becomes an American citizen, spouse and minor children come out of the line and enter immediately, subject to no numerical limitation. In addition, that person acquires the right to bring in his or her parents, not subject to numerical limitation, and acquires the right to sponsor the entry of a brother and sister, subject to numerical limitation. So each new citizen you creates more legal immigrants to the United States. So while Congress, in its infinite wisdom, was militarizing the border to double the net rate of undocumented migration in the United States, by pushing Mexicans towards defensive naturalization, it simultaneously increased legal immigration to the United States from Mexico, which is currently running between 150 and 200,000 entries per year. NAFTA also created economic connections among millions of Mexicans. And the number of temporary legal visas that permit work in the United States has gone steadily upward. And in 2008, there were 360,000 entries from Mexico with temporary work visas of one sort or another. H visas, TN visas, investor visas, exchange visas, and this is not even counting business visas. So we've got this odd circumstance at this point where we have quasi-integrated labor market in North America, with the circulation of people with legal visas, permanent residents, and temporary work visas moving back and forth with increasing frequency, but a static, undocumented population that can't move because of the costs and risks of border crossing. And the presence of 11 million people in the United States and the ongoing campaign of deportations have created a human rights crisis of huge proportions that remains unrecognized by the American public and in the United States generally. 11 million people, 60% of whom are Mexican, lack any social, economic, civil, political right in this country and can be arrested on the authority of a low-level official of law enforcement, thrown into an immigration detention system where they have no rights, no calls to a lawyer, no open court hearing, subject to expedited removal procedures in secret, and they can be held indefinitely and then deported whenever the authorities see fit. Not since the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 have we had so many people living in this country with no civil rights whatsoever. So this is the outgrowth of the fundamentally contradictory policies that the United States has followed since the enactment of NAFTA in 1994, underscoring the urgent need for immigration reform. I published an article in an op-ed piece in the New York Times not long ago with Jorge Castañeda, the former foreign minister of Mexico. In this op-ed piece, we noted that most of the pillars of immigration reform have already been achieved through the Mexican migrants' own actions. The pillars of immigration reform have always been, one, get control of the border. Well, undocumented migration in 2008 stopped rising, fell, and since 2008 has been negative or zero on a net basis. It is the most controlled border anywhere in the world with the possible exception of the Korean DMZ. The border is, for all intents and purposes, as controlled as it ever will be. And any more money spent on border enforcement at a time when net migration is zero is a complete and total waste of taxpayer dollars. Second, expanded guest worker program. Well, as I said, in 2008, there were 360,000 entries with temporary work visas, a number not seen since the days of the Bracero program in the late 1950s. So we already have a de facto guest worker program. Another pillar of immigration reform would be to increase the sizes of the quotas for Mexico. We enacted NAFTA and made no provision for the movement of Mexicans into the United States as a result of economic connections that were bound to be created because of that treaty. So Mexico, a country of 120 million people, $1 trillion economy, our second largest trading partner with whom we share a 2,000-mile border, has the same 25,000 per person per year quota for legal permanent residents as Botswana and Nepal. Makes no sense whatsoever. But, as I pointed out, Mexican migrants have taken it upon themselves to self-increase the quotas by taking out citizenship in record numbers. And 3/4 of people now entering the United States from Mexico as legal permanent residents are relatives of US citizens. And that number will continue. So really the only thing left to do, the most serious need at this point, is a legalization program to provide a pathway to legal status for the 11 million people, 3 million of whom entered as children and grew up in the United States, speak English, graduated from high school, and have no future prospects for social and economic mobility, much less security, unless we remove the burden of illegality from their shoulders. We are now faced with a situation where mass illegality in our immigrant population has become the norm. 60% of all Mexican immigrants present in the United States are out of status. Among Central American immigrants, it's 2/3 to 3/4 are out of status. It's not a small proportion. And mass illegality is now the single most important barrier to the economic integration, social integration of these immigrant populations into the fabric of the United States. And our number one priority moving forward, I believe, is to remove the burden of mass illegality and allow these people to get on with their lives in the country where they have lived for the past 2 decades, or indeed have grown up, the only country they really know. So the crying need, which unfortunately I believe is not going to be dealt with, is for a legalization program. Speaker Boehner yesterday announced that immigration reform was dead and would not be pursued in the current Congress. And it's a human rights tragedy that continues to unfold on a daily basis until something is done to alleviate the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move to Professor Bryan Roberts.
Oh, thank you. I'll just add a footnote to what Monica and Doug have said. I totally agree with both positions, so it has my vote too. Not that that's going to matter in the places where it counts. But I want to add a slight footnote to it, which puts the migration from Mexico to the United States in a wider context of Mexico itself. If we go back to the Bracero program, 1944, on to the early 60s, 1961, I think, is you have a situation where the United States needed labor and instituted this program. We've been doing with colleagues in the Guadalajara area a study of ex-braceros, braceros who were now back, most of them actually, though they originated in the small villages, living now in the city of Guadalajara. One of the interesting things about that program was that when you do life histories with them, you find that their children typically did not migrate to the United States. Why? Because what the Bracero program did, to a certain extent, was to help facilitate the movement of people. It was a secular movement of people in Mexico from the countryside to the cities. This is the period of Mexico's relatively rapid urbanization. Mexico, from being a mainly rural country in the 1940s, becomes a predominantly urban country by the 1980s, and now is, of course, over 80% urban. So and not only is it 80% urban, it's an urban country of fairly large cities. There's not too many, intermediate type. There are some intermediate cities, but even these are relatively large. Smaller cities, no. You don't have many of those left anymore. What you have is places near the big metropolitan regions, etc. So the whole spatial economy and geography of Mexico changes. Now, in the early period, braceros and the rural migrants going to the United States were typically, people were probably slightly less qualified, slightly with less resources than those who moved to the Mexican cities. Mexican urbanization was incredibly successful in absorbing, Mexico's large population growth of those years. And giving them jobs. Okay, jobs in the informal economy and so on, but it was jobs. a better living than they could get in the countryside. So the people who were going to the States then were not actually the people who who were, thinking of going to the cities in search of work. They went temporarily to the United States to get some money to supplement what's going on at home and left their families typically there. That was the movement of it. Many of them then used that to make the transfer to the city. And when they did that, then their children didn't move. The people that kept moving were the people who remained in the rural areas to the United States. That was the historic pattern of Mexican migration to the United States. And it tells us something about the way Mexico's transformation itself under a regime of high population growth, but an industrial growth that could not absorb all of that in high-paying jobs would inevitably lead over time to a push of certain people, especially in the rural areas, and the decline of the rural economy as an economy of subsistence was quite rapid in these years. Okay, so that's one thing as a footnote to all of this. That's the background for what, in terms of judging what's going on, and in terms of both return migration to Mexico nowadays, and in terms of possible out-migration from Mexico nowadays, you have to put it in terms now of an increasingly urban economy in Mexico. It is not a rural economy that can absorb anybody. So increasingly, the people going back will end up on the fringes of metropolitan areas, if not in the centers of cities, but in Mexico. It is unlikely that they will find much of a possibility of such subsistence in the village from which perhaps they emigrated at one point of time. And since so much of deportation, as Doug and others pointed out, is now actually, return migration is deportation. It's not voluntary. We estimated about half of current return migrants are deportees. And many of those, of course, as we mentioned, who've left children, etc., left children, family behind, etc. With that unanticipated return doesn't make it easy for people to adjust. Another issue, which of course is a question also of necessary coordination between the Mexican and the US authorities, people are being deported without coordination. They're literally being dumped on the other side of the bridge. And if you're being dumped on the other side of the bridge in a town like Ciudad Juarez, even to Tijuana, or if you're going down to Matamoros, Brownsville kind of area, you're being dumped in places where the available opportunities to make cash are going to be in the drug economy. This is not a good place to lead anybody. So clearly, there should be better coordination about ensuring that people that have been deported have the resources to get back to where they came from in terms of bus fares and help and that kind of thing. Because at the moment, it really is an absurd situation, which is adding to the problems which we'll be hearing on later today of the border economy. Okay, enough of that. I mean, that situation is bad enough. The point I want to put on the table is a slightly different one, but hopefully will come then into the rest of the panel here. And this is the nature of the kind of economic growth that happened with NAFTA in Mexico. And this is a puzzle. On the whole, if you look at the Latin American growth rates, have been very good in the last decade, and if you take the years 1990 to about 2012, what you do find is actually there has been a bit of a convergence between the Latin American economies and the United States economy. In 1990, the Latin American economies in total were 19%. GDPs were 19% of the American economy, okay? Not very much. But by 2012, they'd now reached 35%. So that's fairly substantial up. However, most of that growth is actually occurring most of it is occurring in Brazil. Mexico's contribution to that growth is much less. And Mexico's growth rate has not been as good. So you have a phenomenon you can say, well, okay, so is this the old dependency type theory, which, admittedly quite discredited in the past, and saying that obviously the closer you are to a core nation, United States and Mexico, etc., the least likely you are to grow, the least likely you are to develop, because the nature of economic exploitation is stronger in a core to a peripheral economy. Well, there's a problem with that, but it's simply because intensified trade will create growth. I mean, it's silly to say it won't. But there is another conundrum here, and that is that if you look at the differences between the other Latin American economies and Mexico, in the nature of their trade relationships, there's a huge difference. On the whole, most exports from Latin America, they're in primary commodities, minerals, of course, and also in agricultural commodities, soybeans and the like, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the majority of exports. The exception is Mexico, where no less than, 71% of Mexicans' exports are in manufactures. So here, you have Mexico, whose exports are in manufactures. Manufacturing, think of import substituted industrialization, was meant to be the solution to kind of job creation. It's primary commodities that created dependence, it was argued, because why should primary commodities actually create jobs or spread wealth? I mean, they don't employ very many people. 200,000 hectares in Brazil can be farmed by 200 people. And American farmers say that's labor intensive. So the commodities don't generate, much labor, whereas manufacturing does. So how come that you have a model of export growth which is manufacturing intensive, and yet somehow or other that is not generating the kinds of wealth and spreading the wealth that it is in other Latin American countries? We know that because, again, Mexico is an exception in another exception. It's the only serious Latin American country in terms of the size of its economy and growth, etc., in which the poverty rate has not declined in recent years. The others, the poverty has declined. In Mexico, it has not. So this is a question, for reflection. What was it about that model? And, answers, I think I'm still, puzzled by this. I assume that, that part of the manufacturing model built on the old maquila model, which is the search for cheap labor, and in which the linkages were not terribly rich, backward and forward linkages between the industries and their suppliers and their providers, etc., was not as good a growth model as other ones could be. So let's remember the location of the old maquila industry, and on the whole, even with NAFTA, that location hasn't changed dramatically. It's mainly in the north. And occasion before NAFTA, a movement of the Mexican population northwards. So you've got a sectoral, a kind of geographical concentration too, another factor in the economic geography of development. So you have these factors in the growth model, and another one I would suggest that it would be very interesting to look at is tax policies. What is it about the model of the industrial kind of growth that NAFTA sponsored in Mexico, the kinds of investment it sponsored, that did it, it's an open question, lead to less tax revenue than did primary commodity exports in other countries? Primary commodities are relatively easy to tax. But if you're arranging, investment, encouraging foreign investment, in manufacturing and following through with some of the old, maquila agreements, your tax revenue may not be so good. So again, we have to look at it. What was it about the kind of model of economic growth that NAFTA, did that led to the really very disappointing, performance of NAFTA for the Mexican economy compared with countries that were not part of these bilateral or trilateral, trade agreements. So that is, I think, a question that we really need to look at and do more research on. And by the way, of course, just as President Cedillo remarked yesterday and in the conversations that were had, we should not forget, of course, the Mexican side of this. The fact that you did not put oil on the table, et cetera, the fact that other institutional sectors were not reformed, and of course education is a glaring example of this. There were other things that were slowing down the Mexican economy. And of course, we have to put on the table, as was put by President Zedillo yesterday, the whole issue of the drug economy in Mexico, et cetera. And again, because that, along with migration, is another glaring example of the way neither country, and in this perhaps in America has more to, has to also be included. Neither country really did anything serious about the drug problem. America, as we know, is the biggest consumer of drugs. It's also one of the major sources of the guns that feed the violence in Mexico. Yet there's been very little cooperation other than actually counterproductive cooperation over trying to capture, kill off cartel leaders, which has basically led to increasing violence, not to less violence. But instead of dialogues about decriminalization, legalization, etc., we find the American position as being the straitjacket of supply reduction, not demand reduction. Again, this is not helpful in terms of, the cooperative relationship with Mexico. Okay, I think that's what.
Fantastic. Okay, we'll move to our final presenters, Ernesto Cortes and Jacob Cortes.
Excuse me. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm always curious about what someone like me has to offer to this kind of conversation. I'm not a professor. I'm not a policy wonk. So that which I have to offer comes out of my own experience as an organizer. I'm co-director of the national co-director of the Industrial Areas Foundation, which is the Saul David Alinsky Training Institute. So what I do is to create broad-based organizations. I won't bore you by telling you where I work, but I'll say that a lot of where I work is along the border, in the Rio Grande Valley with Valley Interfaith, in El Paso, Del Rio, Eagle Pass, in Laredo, in Tucson, Arizona, Yuma, Arizona, all across the border. We have IAF organizations which have to deal with some of the issues that we've talked about. With me is Jacob Cortes, who is the lead organizer of Austin Interfaith, but has had organizing experience also in Arizona, as well as in Texas, in Houston, and was an SEIU organizer at one time. So hopefully he can bring some direct experience of what we have learned from working with some of these implications of both of what we're talking about, NAFTA. Let me start off by making, again, a few disclaimers, okay, and create a little bit of a context. We first began to deal with NAFTA, in fact, we had Professor Weintraub come to a number of seminars to try to help us understand what were the implications of it. And then and now, I have kind of a mixed feeling about it. On the one hand, I've always been for integration, economic integration of the economies of Mexico, the United States, Canada, Central America, because I thought it would be good for both the United States and Canada, but more importantly, I thought it would be really, really good for Mexico, Central America, South America. But I always had troubles because I thought that what we were really doing with NAFTA, notwithstanding the fact that it was a free trade agreement, was really trying to create incentives for foreign investment, because Mexico needed a great deal. Savings rates were very, very low. But the real foreign investment that we were really looking for was getting Mexicans to put their money back into Mexico. Because so many Mexicans, because of the devaluation crisis, very wealthy Mexicans, were putting their capital outside the country. And my aunt Beatriz told me that, who lived then in Mexico City, said that, you know, asked her about Echeverria, and she said, well, you know, he's like everybody else, a crook. But, you know, the other guys, when they would export their capital before the devaluation crisis, they would bring it back, and that SOB didn't, okay? And that was kind of her estimation of what was going on, and that they would begin to see more and more rich, wealthy Mexicans abandoning the country. And, you know, she was not an economist, she just was trying to run a business in Mexico City. Both her and my cousins had to migrate to the United States. Fortunately, they had dual citizenship because they could not make it in their businesses. So that was one kind of bias that I had, was that just spending a lot of time with her and my other relatives in the capital. But also, I'm an immigrant son. My father was born in Jalapa, Veracruz. And he came over during the revolution and was undocumented or illegal or whatever you want to call it, unauthorized. I like the term unauthorized. Until he was in his 40s. And so I guess if I had been living in Arizona you know, during the debate over the immigration issues, I would have been probably subject to deportation. So that kind of gnaws at me a little bit in thinking about all these kind of questions. So, you know, and I've seen the benefit of my family coming over and starting businesses, raising families, integrating themselves in both society and economy of the hometown, my hometown, San Antonio, which is now in around 70% Mexicano. Notwithstanding that, we celebrate the defeat of the Mexican army at the Battle of San Jacinto every year during Fiesta Week, okay? And so growing up in San Antonio has always been very, very problematic, okay? Because of that cultural conflict. And so that also affects, you know, how I look at the world. And finally, just in terms of my biases, we were organizing very successfully in Arizona prior to the 2004 election with the governor, then Governor Janet Napolitano, who said to 2,000 of our leaders at a meeting, I'm the daughter of an immigrant, okay, and I'm never going to engage in any kind of anti-immigrant policies. When the Arizona legislature were passing all kinds of bills anti-immigrant, and she was the backstop for that because she would continually veto those legislative policies and always insisting that we back her up as she would do that. So it was kind of difficult for me, frankly, to figure out how did she go from being that kind of governor to the Secretary of Homeland Security deporting almost 500,000 immigrants every year, imposing draconian quotas on the ICE officers where they would, and I have no other word for it, and so forgive me if I offend anybody. Again, I beg everybody's pardon here, using near Gestapo tactics, okay? Middle of the night raids to families, knocking on doors, looking for somebody who wasn't there, using all kinds of rises to get entrance in the door, and then immediately going after the father or the mother and arresting them and deporting them. And their defense was they had to fill their quota. because the money had been appropriated and they had to fill their quota. And finding out that there were detention centers which were being filled, again, because they had to fill their quota. And because the money had been appropriated. And I share with great support the position of my fellow panelists that that is a big, huge waste of money, and to support a very tragic and problematic policy. So I think one of the consequences of all this has got to be to look at what it has done to the politics of the United States. And it has taken people who are, used to be halfway sane and turned them nuts, okay? I have no other word to say for it, except that they become hysterically paranoid, paranoid and nuts, okay? And we have now created this militarized border zone. I really kind of resonated with the chancellor's remarks about the Rio Grande Valley, because that was when my father would take me down to the valley, because he worked for Pepsi-Cola and would work with bottlers in Harlingen and Laredo and all over the place. And it was virtually an open border. You could go back and forth at will. And there was understanding that nobody, as long as you didn't go north of the border checkpoint, that you could go back and forth between Brownsville and Matamoros. In fact, people used to say that Matamoros was a suburb, Brownsville was a suburb of Matamoros, okay? And the same thing was true about the Dos Laredos, and the same thing was true about El Paso and Juarez, and we just walk across and go back, eat and work, etc. In fact, when we were organizing back in the 80s when Bill Hobby was lieutenant governor, okay, wistfully thinking about those days, and passing an indigent health care bill, the reality of health care in the Rio Grande Valley was Mexico. That was where people went for doctors, they went for pharmacies, they went everywhere, okay? So now we have this militarized zone, okay, and people are afraid to go, okay, because of the way, and I always wanted to say when George Bush was president, Mr. Bush, tear down this wall. I wanted to be like Ronald Reagan at the Brandenburg Gates, and said so in many statements, because, the border, the wall goes right through the campus, or what then was Texas Southmost. Okay, and if you go down there, it's kind of horrible to look at, okay, and ugly. And silly and tragic, and has again produced all kinds of ugly reactions and changed the politics negatively. Now, we can lament this till 11 o'clock, okay, so I won't do that and won't bore you with that, except to say that what that challenges us is how to think about organizing these people, these folks. And I share everything that's been said before, particularly, in fact, most of my thunder is, I thought I'd have some numbers to present to you, just to be able to earn my lunch. But I decided I'll just echo what was said before about the fact that Mexico has not shared in the prosperity of Latin America. And to me, it's ironic, and just the question I want to ask, okay, is most other Latin American countries have had the good sense not to abide by the Washingtonian consensus. But the Mexicans have been just, almost to a T. In fact, they used to say, jokingly, that the first name of Carlos Salinas de Cotari was Harvard educated. Because every time he would be introduced, he would say, Harvard educated Carlos Salinas de Cotari, okay? And so it was kind of that kind of mindset that the Mexicans were going to totally be, and I don't know whether that was Harvard or Yale or MIT or whatever, because that's where you'd always see all these folks, but they would take that particular position. Okay, I'm told I only have 5 minutes left, so I want to turn over the last part of my presentation to my colleague, José Cortes, to talk a little bit about what we're doing vis-a-vis organizing of workers. Okay.
Again, my name is Jacob Cortes. I'm the lead organizer of Austin Interfaith. IF organizations are coalitions of churches, labor unions, synagogues, schools, nonprofit organizations that teach ordinary people how to improve their communities. We organize for the common good, for social justice. And one of the things that we face are the consequences of NAFTA, migration to the United States, and workers, some with some skills, some professional degrees in their home countries, some with no skills or trade skills, but they work in low-wage service sector jobs. Here in Austin, we're organizing the taxi drivers. 900 taxi drivers have now organized so that approximately half, 450, are members of the Taxi Drivers Union, which is the third union in the country to be recognized by the AFL-CIO. These folks work for $2 to $3 an hour. We were able to get them $1 an hour per passenger after 6, so if you pay a little bit more to get to and from the airport at night, then that's our fault, because you get charged an extra $1 an hour per passenger, and every other person gets charged $1 per passenger in an effort to raise the wages to lift the floor of these workers who have no health insurance, no benefits, no retirement, and are not even insured in case there's an accident. So their human dignity is not even recognized by the cab companies that receive their permits from the city of Austin. We've helped organize laborers and construction workers, most recently in October by passing a living wage ordinance that raises the floor for workers to $11 an hour for any company that moves to Austin or receives a tax benefit from the city. They have to pay their employees $11 minimum, all temporary and contract workers $11 minimum, and construction workers $11 minimum wage, or the prevailing wage, whichever is higher, which is the most progressive living wage ordinance in the South of the United States. We've helped organize teachers' unions, which represent classified employees that include culinary workers, bus drivers, and janitors. At one point, AISD did not want to pay health benefits to any of these workers. We fought with Education Austin so that they do have health insurance. In Houston, organizing with our organization there, Houston Interfaith, and the Metropolitan Organization, we organized an interfaith press conference in support of the janitors, who were making $8.35 an hour, wanted 10. We were able to, by supporting them, on the last day of the strike, as negotiations went through, we held a press conference. The following day, the contractors ceded and agreed to $1 an hour up to $9.35 over 4 years for some of the lowest paid workers in America. These are janitors that half of whom are undocumented, that work in the major buildings, the corporate towers downtown in Houston and in the Galleria area, and have very little labor protections. We were able to get them not only the wage increase, but health benefits, a health care plan for $20 a month. This is possible by building trust in communities, organizing in institutions, being hopefully bilingual and at least one or two foreign languages, and recognizing some of the cultural differences, some of the basic human needs, and connecting individuals to institutional leaders that are diverse, that are made up of immigrant communities, African American, Jewish American, and Anglo American. So it's not all bad. Despite some of NAFTA's consequences, we are able to lift the floor for a large number of American workers. This is necessary because NAFTA is in part responsible for the loss of about 1 million unionized jobs, manufacturing jobs, in the United States. Just in closing, one of the things that I like to think about, there's a lot of talk about growth in Latin American countries versus Mexico. I find it interesting that, at a certain point, between $30 and $40 billion a year in remittances were coming from the United States from workers of Mexican origin back into Mexico. If you add that $30 or $40 billion to the 50 billion plus of profit generated from the narco trade, then Mexico, all that cash coming into Mexico is spent. Mexico would probably have about zero growth since 1994. And so I would really challenge all of you to think about both the formal economy and what's reported, and the informal economy, what's not reported in macroeconomic studies, because those industries of migration, both smuggling and the remittances that are then sent back home, and the drug trade are a significant part of both the Mexican economy and have consequences for the labor force in both countries.
We're out of time, so just want to make one point. I've read recently that one of the difficulties with thinking about a lot of issues like this, a big difficulty in thinking about all these things, is that folks like us tend to try to isolate a public policy from a context and a background. And I'm not sure you can really do that. And that's part of the difficulty I have today in thinking about all this, is you can't just look at NAFTA in isolation. You got to look at what is going on in the context. And one of the things that happened in Mexico prior to NAFTA was the fact that Salinas, to be a good citizen, cut significantly, the Mexicans cut significantly the public sector, which was deemed to be very, very bloated. Well, the problem was, what do you do with people when you fire massively lots of public servants? What do they do then? Well, a lot of the police officers who were fired became kidnappers, okay? And number one. Number two is the Mexican political parties were told that they couldn't have money for their slush money. They couldn't have patriots money. Well, PRI could not operate without lots and lots of money. If they couldn't get it, okay, from the government, they had to go somewhere. Well, where do they go? At least our friend, my friend Jorge Castaneda said they went to the drug lords, okay, and they began to get money from them, and they became on a slippery slope, and which created all kinds of problems, okay. Number three, the Green Revolution, I think Henry Wallace introduced the Green Revolution when he was Secretary of Agriculture under Franklin Roosevelt, created enormous productivity in agriculture in Mexico. And the United States has always been trying to think about how we do that. The problem is, what do you do with those farm workers, okay? And one of the issues that I thought was never really thought through very carefully with NAFTA, and I raised this question with lots and lots of people, including Mexican, consulate people, was what are you going to do with the people who work in the corn industry, which was heavily subsidized, when you start to remove those subsidies? And I said, aren't they going to move to the cities? And aren't they going to then depress wages and push people to the United States, okay? And they said, no, we've thought about that, we're going to do it over time, et cetera. Well, they didn't think about it carefully enough. And it did happen. Those folks did move to the cities, they did depress wages, and they pushed people from the cities into the United States, which was at that time needed, wanted, okay? The Republican Mormon mayor of Yuma, Arizona told me that we cannot survive in southern Arizona, our agribusiness cannot survive without immigrant workers, okay? In Nebraska, okay, in Omaha, the meatpacking plants survived and were productive because of workers from Mexico and Central America. Now, those workers were mistreated, they were oppressed as a result of that, but my point is we did not think about what are the unintended consequences of changing some of the internal dynamics of the Mexican economy. And we never do, and that's part of our challenge. It would be nice if trade agreements were made by economists, okay, but they aren't. They're made by politicians, they're made by lobbyists, labor and corporate lobbyists, they're made by all kinds of people who've got vested interests, okay, to protect and create all kinds of negative consequences as a result. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those excellent presentations on a wide number of topics related to NAFTA and labor. I'll just mention that I've been alerted via text message that UT Austin will now be closed for the entire day today. I do not believe that will affect our conference, except perhaps in a few logistical ways that Professor Ward will mention after the panel concludes. But I believe it'll go on. Okay, we'll go on as planned. But if that affects you personally, now you know. So these wonderful presentations have discussed the dynamics and problems of labor migration and immigration in the post-NAFTA era. I just want to add a few observations, and then we'll have time for comments and questions from the attendants here. As Mr. Cortes noted at the end here, agriculture wasn't really highlighted in many of the presentations. Of course, lowering tariff barriers in agriculture was a key part of NAFTA, but it was decided that agricultural tariffs would be phased out quite slowly over the course of 15 years to allow agricultural workers time to readjust to the new economic reality. And part of the plan was that foreign direct investment would flow into the rural sector to help ameliorate the degree of labor dislocation. But it turns out that less than 1% of all foreign direct investment in Mexico has flowed to the rural sector. And so when tariffs were finally phased out in 2009, this caused massive dislocations, certainly in the arena of corn, where it's much cheaper to produce corn in the United States. We produce it at about a quarter of the price using mechanized farms. And so, of course, despite the fact that 80% of Mexico is now living in large and medium-sized cities, a fair amount of the pressure from migrant and immigrant labor comes from people who are dislocated off of small-sized farms. There are a few sort of new types of immigration that are going on that weren't mentioned, and I'll just quickly put on the table. In recent years, I've been contacted quite frequently by lawyers who are working on behalf of asylum seekers. The increasing violence in Mexico has created pressure for people to flee certain areas, and we're getting increased requests for political asylum. And I don't have any figures on the number of requests. Perhaps some of the presenters or people in the audience do, but it's something that I've noticed that's on the rise. And of course, the situation in Mexico has deteriorated to the point where we might see an increase in these kinds of requests. And then one comment about immigration management system in the U.S. One of the more heartrending elements of this came out a few years ago regarding family detention centers here in the U.S. They're increasingly run by private enterprises. We had one here not very far away in Hutto, Texas. I routinely ride my bicycle out there. It's probably about 35 miles from here. And these immigration detention centers that held families and minors were largely unregulated and unmonitored by government officials, and in a number of cases had deplorable conditions and treatment. And these kinds of things have only sort of recently come to light. So those are just a few observations about disparate issues that I wanted to sort of add to the excellent presentations today. There seem to be sort of no end of criticisms to the issues that NAFTA has created regarding labor migration and immigration. And I'm wondering if we could kick off the commentaries. Maybe we'll go to the audience first, but at a certain point I would love to hear from the panelists about proposals about what we can do to improve the conditions. But maybe what we'll do first is we'll get a number of questions and comments from people in the audience. Please use the microphones. Where are the microphones? Their microphones are traveling. So raise your hand and people will bring around the microphones. I'll ask that you keep the questions and comments relatively on point. We have another 15 minutes, but we'd like to give the panelists time to respond. So why don't we collect about 5 or 6 comments and questions, and then we'll have the panelists respond.
Good morning, and thank you very much. Very quick question regarding a lot of the presentations. Mexican immigration to the United States, of course, has a long history, and there have been significant flows in the past. This is not the first time. Mexico's had over 10% of its population outside of Mexico, primarily in the United States. However, as Professor Massey pointed out, Mexican migration has been net zero for over 6 years almost. What is increasing is Central American migration. So the question is, given the demographic and economic changes in Mexico, and given the changes in the United States in labor participation, do you see the end of large-scale Mexican migration? Do we have to be worried not about having hit peak oil, but about having hit peak Mexicans?
Other questions? Comments?
Hi, thank you very much. I have a particular question about the reintegration process for recent deportees from the United States to Mexico, in particular the youth who have college education, who have been through the American education system, who came here as children and have recently been deported back to Mexico. What is known? Do any of you know anything about the reintegration process for them into the Mexican education system or into the Mexican labor market? Is there any bilateral communication between the two governments, the United States and Mexico, to facilitate some kind of a reintegration for highly educated deportees?
Thank you.
Just curious, what percentage do y'all think, that's a term we use here in Texas, y'all, what percentage of the border wall do you think is an unintended effect of NAFTA?
Hi, thank you for an excellent presentation. I have here the statistics for asylum seekers. In year 2012, 9,206 Mexican asylum seekers applied for asylum, out of which 126 were granted. In a related question is that given the wave of violence that Mexico experienced between 2009 and 2012, basically, a lot of cases occurred where Mexican business people migrated to the United States. One of the main recipient states were Texas, along with California. So these business people come with their money under an E2, E1 visa, putting $500,000 to open up their business and giving jobs to about five people, given the rules. I think that is another element that has to be taken into account, along with the fact that indeed there was a negotiation within NAFTA in which we established standards that were bilaterally and trilaterally widely accepted for professions as a vehicle for opening up the quotas for professional temporary workers. And we have never reached that quota, meaning lawyers, nurses, so on and so forth.
Hi, my name is Katie Putnam. I'm a PhD student at University of Texas, and these were really interesting presentations. I wanted to ask about immigration reform. At the end of Dr. Verea's comments, you mentioned that perhaps NAFTA could be a platform for talking about immigration reform, though it seems like one of the takeaways from the whole enchilada attempt in the early 2000s was that it's very difficult for Mexico to have a role in the immigration debate in the U.S. And so sort of a two-part question. First, if it is a U.S. political issue, what prospects do you see for immigration reform, given the Republican strategy that belief that this is not going to help them in the midterm elections or the presidential election? And two, is there still a role at all for Mexico in immigration reform? Thank you.
And I have one question. As it's been mentioned in this conference today, net immigration for the last 6 years has been zero. What are the main causes behind this sudden drop that, according to statistics, it's actually American migration to Mexico is now actually larger than the other way around? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, 5 minutes. I thought we had 10 minutes. 5 minutes? We have 5 minutes. Okay, we get 1 minute per. Why don't we move in the order of the original presentations?
Well, first of all, return migration. It's a big problem in Mexico. Children coming from the United States that have been educated here, integrated in Mexican schools that they are really having lots of problem to integrate in their towns of origin because they don't speak Spanish. So they have troubles with teachers and the students, and integrating with the other persons that live in those towns. So this is a big problem. Mexico government has not get into an infrastructure to solve this problem that is incrementing. And TN NAFTA visas, it's a proposition. That could be think about it to expand it to another professions, medium skilled undocumented workers or low skilled, to expand TN visa that has been really very low, has been very poor advantage. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, my personal view is that the boom in Mexican immigration is probably over and won't be coming back. Because of NAFTA, there's going to be a lot of people circulating within the North American system, but the massive flow of one-sided flow from Mexico to the United States is probably over for a variety of reasons, and very different conditions on both sides of the border. On the U.S. side, the increase in access to legal visas of various sorts has opened up new channels for legal immigration. And the withering of labor demand in the United States, particularly in residential home construction, which was a main driver in the 2000s. That demand is gone and is not coming back anytime in the near future. On the Mexican side, rates of population growth have gone down to almost a replacement level. It's about 2.2, 2.3 children per woman now. And Mexico is becoming an aging society. Labor force growth is decelerating. So there's not the demographic pressures on the Mexican side. At the same time, levels of education have risen quite dramatically as a result of the conditional cash transfer programs that Mexico has been implementing over the past several sexennios. So you're getting a smaller number of people entering the labor force with higher levels of education. And education, initial year of education, if you don't have a document in the United States, doesn't get you anything. But it does get you something in Mexico's urban sector. So people that used to migrate from the rural areas to the urban areas are increasing, to the United States are increasingly going to urban areas. And finally, the rural sector just continues to decline. The rural sector has always been a disproportionate contributor of migrants to the United States, but it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller as Mexico becomes a fully urbanized society. So the conditions for mass migration are really disappearing quite rapidly in North America, and I don't see it coming back anytime soon.
Unfortunately, I'm sorry, excuse me.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just to say, unfortunately, right now there's probably no prospects for immigration reform as we think about it. There are prospects for minor adjustments to it, like California just re-granted a driver's license to immigrants. Okay, so and what they're going to do is that they have a driver's license which was designed by a man who's very proud of it because it's never been counterfeited. So they're going to change it from a DL to a DP, but the change will be imperceptible. But nonetheless, you know, it'll be a change in terms of the system, the software system. But we've still had to meet with police chiefs, with the sheriffs, and to make sure that it's clear that a traffic infraction will not result in deportation or arrest. And we've had to have joint training sessions with our leaders and the police departments of these areas to do that in places like San Rafael in Marin County, Sacramento, all over the state of California. And so those kind of things of getting expanded Medicaid in California, you can't, obviously immigrants are not eligible for Medicaid. But the County of Los Angeles provides what they call a match program so that they will give to clinics who serve immigrants, you know, partial equivalent of Medicaid. So we're working very hard to get counties to expand, okay, their health services to people who are undocumented so that it becomes in the interest of clinics, okay, who are the recipients of county money, they will get more dollars, okay, by being willing to serve people who are undocumented. Now, that's taken a lot of work with foundations, with public policy institutes, with the state of California to put up some of that kind of money. So those are the kind of things that I think we're going to have to begin to do, okay, internally, as well as begin to create a political constituency which recognizes this is not, we don't want to be like Germany, where you have a group of people who've been there as second-class citizens for so long, okay, that they will not use the word German next to them. We had a conference of Muslims, of our organizations from Britain and the United States and Germany. The British Muslims call themselves British Muslims, the American Muslims call themselves American Muslims. The German Muslims say, we're Muslims, period. We're not Germans, they don't want us, and we don't want them. Now, I don't think that's a good thing, okay, to have 11 million people who feel so alienated and so under the, that they feel that kind of visceral, okay, repugnance about the culture, politics of the United States. Jacob, quickly, about Lamar Smith.
Oh, sure. So, immigration reform prospects in the current Congress at zero. My congressman, who might be the worst congressman in America, Lamar Smith, tells us in meetings, when we meet with him, we organize 2 meetings of clergy with him in San Antonio, he says, well, we not only have to secure the border, we have to secure the interior. So there's no definition of border security, and now the bar has been raised to securing the entire interior. And that is driven by campaign contributions of the contractors that manage the deportation facilities, that build the walls, that build the drones that fly across the border, and all the equipment for our Border Patrol and other paramilitary services. So unless you address the issue of where the money's coming from to these members of the House and Senate that are blocking immigration reform, and you can build a constituency, as Ernesto Cortes mentioned, that can overpower those moneyed interests by educating immigrants how to vote for their interests, for their families, then there's zero prospect for immigration reform.
Just 2 points. One, to clarify a little what was happening in Mexico, the decline of people coming into the United States. That seems, if you look at both talking to people and looking at the statistics, to be mainly a product of returned migrants not repeating their move back to the United States. I.e. someone who might have gone to the United States every year or whatever, or every 2 years or so on, so like short term, come back home and go out again, they stop doing it. And they stopped doing it because the border security, not only the wall, etc., and all that, and the costs of crossing it, but also because of the dangers with the drug wars on it. So that has been, a substantial deterrent. And that deterrent, in the culture of migration that you get in villages, etc., can pass on to, even younger kids who might be thinking of going north, etc., and trying it, but the experiences of people coming back and staying will deter them. So that's that side of it. But one caveat on this, one of the issues, and not just for Mexico, it's been the whole of Latin America, is yes, demographic downturn, but that is still left, and we're still seeing it, with a substantial youth bulge in Latin America. And there's very high levels of youth unemployment throughout Latin America. The economies in none of these countries, even the fairly dynamic one, can absorb these youths. That is true of Mexico too. Studies that are done show that opportunity that is, however well it's done in raising education levels, doesn't get people jobs. So what you educate people, and especially if you're doing it in rural areas, they're not going to find a job there. They go to the cities, they may be unemployed there too. So they are a mobile and available population. It's perfectly possible that they could start to migrate again, or of course get involved in the marginal activities of the cities, which is one of the fuels of the drug kind of violence and the other criminal violence going on now. So that's a caveat. That situation is not stabilizing. Demographic cavalry, is emerging over the hill, but it still hasn't reached us yet. That's the point.
Thank you. We're running a little bit behind schedule today. We had planned to have a break from 10:30 to 10:45 and start the second panel then. It's 10:51 now. I propose a 9-minute break, and we'll start at 11. Okay, excellent. Please join me in thanking the presenters.